Look at the side of it. Really look. Run your eye up from the rubble at the base to the flat crown 800 feet above, and you will see them. Long vertical lines. Hundreds of them, packed shoulder to shoulder, rising in a slow taper, the way the grain of a tree rises toward its canopy. On a grey afternoon, when the light goes soft, the whole formation stops looking like stone and starts looking like something that was once alive, like the stump of a tree so enormous that no living thing on earth today could stand beside it. The vertical lines look like bark. The fluting between them looks like the channels rain would cut down the trunk of an ancient conifer, and the more you stare, the harder it becomes to unsee it. Geologists have a name for those vertical lines. They call it columnar jointing. They wrote that name into the survey reports in the 1880s, filed it, and moved on. The tower became a national monument, then a movie set, then a postcard. But the name never explained the feeling. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It labeled the pattern and left the question standing exactly where it started, 1,000 feet tall, in the middle of Wyoming, refusing to look like anything a river or a volcano was supposed to leave behind. This is the story of Devil's Tower. Not the Geology brochure version, the version underneath it. Because the strange thing about this rock is not that people once thought it was a tree. The strange thing is what happened to the ground around it once the naming was done. Who got to name it? Who got to price it? And who got to keep the land it stands on? Make of that what you will. Start with what is actually there, because the object is stranger than the arguments about it. Devil's Tower rises out of the rolling pine country of the Bear Lodge Mountains in the northeast corner of Wyoming, near the Belfourche River. From the surrounding grassland it climbs about 386 meters from base to summit, and the summit itself sits more than a mile above sea level. The top is nearly flat, an acre and a half of prairie grass and cactus and the occasional snake, sealed off from the world below by walls that in places go straight up without a single ledge. Those walls are the columns. Most of them have 4, 5, or 6 sides, packed together like a bundle of pencils stood on end. Some are as much as 3 meters across. They are among the largest columns of their kind found anywhere on the planet, and running the length of each one are the fine horizontal cross marks and the long vertical striations that catch the light and read, to the human eye, as bark. The columns are not smooth pipes. They are ridged and grooved and slightly irregular, and that irregularity is exactly what makes the trunk reading so persuasive. A perfect geometric crystal would look manufactured. This looks grown. So people said it was grown, not the geologists, at least not the ones with the survey contracts, but a steady undercurrent of observers going back generations and swelling in recent years into a whole online movement. The claim is simple and, on its face, almost reasonable. What if Devil's Tower is not a rock at all? What if it is the fossil remains of a colossal tree, sheared off near the base, its inner trunk turned to stone, its bark preserved as the vertical fluting we now call columns? What if the reason it looks like a stump is that it is one? The movement that carries this idea folds Devil's Tower into a much larger picture. In that picture, the Earth was once home to silicon-based trees miles high, forests that dwarfed anything in the fossil record, and the flat-topped mesas and buttes and towers scattered across the American West are their sawn-off remains. Devil's Tower is the poster child because it is so vertical, so isolated, so obviously columnar. Mount Roraima in South America gets pulled in. The Giant's Causeway in Ireland gets pulled in. Anything with vertical sides and a flat top becomes a stump, and the world becomes a clear cut, and modern geology becomes the thing that quietly cleaned up the evidence and handed us a smaller, tamer planet than the one that actually existed. It is easy to laugh at. It is harder to explain why it feels true when you are standing there, and the honest thing to do, before dismantling it, is to admit that the feeling is doing real work. The tower is out of scale with everything around it. There is nothing else like it for miles. Your brain reaches for the nearest familiar shape that has vertical grain and a flat top, and the nearest familiar shape is a tree. That is not stupidity. That is pattern recognition doing exactly what it evolved to do. Now here is where the honesty has to cut the other way, because when you actually put the rock under a lens, the tree reading falls apart, and it falls apart on the one piece of evidence a tree can never fake. Cellulose. Wood is made of cells. Cut a real tree, living or petrified, and under magnification you find the structure of life, growth rings marking the seasons, cell walls, vascular channels that once carried water up and sugar down. Go to the petrified forest in Arizona, and you can see it plainly. Whole logs turn to agate and quartz that still show their rings, still show their bark texture, still carry the microscopic fingerprint of having once been alive. That is what a fossil tree looks like. It looks like a tree all the way down. Devil's Tower does not. Put the rock of the tower under a lens and you find crystals. Interlocking grains of feldspar and pyroxene in a fine grey-green matrix. The rock has a name, phonolite porphyry, a rare igneous rock that rings faintly when you strike a thin plate of it, which is where the phonolite name comes from, the sounding stone. There are no growth rings. There are no cells. There is no bark in any structural sense, only the surface texture of cooling and cracking. Whatever the tower is, it is not carbon and cellulose pretending to be stone. It is stone that never pretended to be anything else. On that single point, the tree hypothesis simply ends. So what makes the columns? The mainstream answer is the one written into the name, and it is worth actually understanding rather than waving past. When a thick mass of molten rock cools, it contracts. It shrinks. And a shrinking sheet of anything, from drying mud to cooling lava to cornstarch left to dry in a dish, tends to crack into polygons. The most efficient way for a contracting surface to relieve its stress is to break into hexagons, because hexagons tile a plane with the least total crack length. As the cooling front moves inward through the mass, each crack propagates along with it, following the retreating heat, and the polygon at the surface extends downward into a long column. The vertical striations, the horizontal cross marks, the fine chisel-like grooves that read as bark, all of it is the record of that crack advancing in tiny steps as the rock gave up its heat over years and decades. It is not bark. It is a fracture, frozen mid-travel. You can watch a smaller version of it happen. It is the same physics that makes the mud of a dry lake bed break into plates, only slowed down and scaled up and turned vertical by the geometry of a cooling igneous body. The columns of Devil's Tower, and the columns of the Giant's Causeway, and the columns under the Devil's Postpile in California are all the same phenomenon at different sizes. Contraction, cracking, nothing grown. That is the settled answer to the bark question, but notice what it settles and what it leaves wide open. It explains the surface. It does not, on its own, explain the whole tower. And this is the part the brochures tend to smooth over, because here the geologists genuinely do not agree with each other, and have not agreed for more than a century. Everyone accepts the rock is igneous, that it welled up as magma from below rather than being laid down as sediment. The fight is about the shape of that intrusion, and whether the tower ever reached the surface at all. In 1888, the geologist Nelson Horatio Darton looked at it and called it a laccolith, a blister of magma that pushed up between layers of sedimentary rock and domed them without breaking through, later exposed when the softer rock around it eroded away. Others argued it was the neck of a volcano, the frozen throat of an eruption whose cone has long since worn to nothing. Still others have argued for a Mar diatrema, a violent gas-driven pipe, or a simple stock, a plug of magma that stalled underground. Studies through the 20th century and into the 21st have swung between these readings. No exposed roots of an ancient volcano have been found nearby. No matching lava flows. The honest state of the science is that we know what the rock is and roughly when it cooled, around 40 million years ago, and we are still arguing about how the magma got there and how much of it we have lost. Sit with that for a second, because it matters to everything that follows. The name columnar jointing is not a lie. It is a real and correct description of the vertical lines, but it was doing double duty. It answered the small question, what are the grooves? in a way that let everyone stop asking the large question, what is this whole thing and why is it here? The label closed the file, and the moment the file was closed, the interesting economics could begin. Because a named thing can be claimed, and an unnamed thing cannot. Consider the name itself, Devil's Tower. It is on every map, every sign, every park ranger's shirt, and it comes from a single expedition and, by most accounts, a single mistake. In 1875, a United States military and scientific party under Colonel Richard Irving Dodge rode into the Black Hills country. Dodge's expedition was there in the wake of the Custer expedition of the year before, the one that had confirmed gold in the Black Hills and lit the fuse on everything that came after. One of Dodge's men, or Dodge himself in his later writing, recorded that the local tribes called the formation Bad God's Tower. From Bad God's Tower to Devil's Tower is a short and convenient slide. Convenient, because a place named for a bad god is a place a Christian nation can feel entitled to survey, to name, to open. The trouble is that no native nation in the region seems to have called it anything of the kind. The names that Lakota, Cheyenne, Kiowa, Arapaho, Crow, and Shoshone people used and still use translate to things like Bear Lodge, Bear's Tippy, Bear's House, Grizzly Bear Lodge, Tree Rock, and Greyhorn Butte. Bear, over and over. Not a devil anywhere in it. The most common Lakota name, Matotipila, means Bear Lodge. The devil appears to have been imported, whether through mistranslation, mishearing, or the simple habit of a survey that found it easier to sell a frontier full of demons than a frontier full of somebody else's churches. There is even a smaller ghost inside the name, one that survives to this day. The official spelling carries no apostrophe. It is Devil's Tower, not Devil's Tower, because when the monument was proclaimed, the federal naming authorities followed a standing rule against apostrophes in place names, and the possessive mark was simply dropped. So the name we were left with does not even pass. It is not the tower belonging to a devil. It is, grammatically, a bare plural of devils, or nothing at all, a label that lost its own meaning somewhere in the paperwork. A bear became a devil, and then the devil lost its apostrophe, and the sign at the entrance has carried that doubled error for well over a century without anyone trying to correct it. And the tower is a church. To the Lakota and half a dozen other nations, Matotipila is one of the most sacred places in the world, tied to origin and to the turning of the year. The story most often told explains the very thing this whole video started with, the bark lines. In the story, a group of young girls, 7 in most tellings, are out playing when they are chased by a giant bear. They climb onto a low rock and pray to it to save them, and the rock begins to rise, lifting them into the sky beyond the reach of the animal. The bear leaps and claws at the sides of the growing tower, again and again, and its claws carve the long vertical grooves that run from base to summit. The girls are carried up into the heavens and become the stars of the Pleiades, the little cluster that sits in the sky, not far from where the tower points. Read that story again and look at the columns. The claw marks and the bark lines are the same lines. 2 peoples, the surveyors and the Lakota, stood in front of the identical fluted stone. One saw a crack in cooling magma and wrote columnar jointing. One saw the claws of a bear that saved 7 children and built a cosmology around it. And the modern silicon tree movement, without knowing it, reached for a 3rd reading of those exact same grooves, bark, and in doing so proved only how loud those vertical lines are, how badly the human eye wants them to mean something more than contraction. The point is not that the bear story is literally geology. The point is that the naming was never neutral. Whoever gets to name the rock gets to frame the land. And in 1875, with gold freshly confirmed in the hills to the east, the framing was worth a fortune. That framing had teeth again in our own time. In 2014 and 2015, a formal proposal went to the United States Board on Geographic Names to change the official name from Devil's Tower to Bear Lodge, restoring the older meaning. It was backed by native leaders, including the Lakota spiritual leader Arvel Looking Horse, and by figures in South Dakota, and it ran straight into a wall built out of money. The Wyoming congressional delegation moved to block it. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The argument was not really about history. The argument was about the brand. Devil's Tower is a known quantity. It is printed on 100,000 souvenirs. It anchors the tourism economy of an entire corner of the state, and there was open worry that renaming it would confuse visitors and cost the towns nearby their draw. A separate proposal even sought to freeze the name Devil's Tower in place by law so the board could not change it. The sacred name lost to the marketable one. The devil stayed, because the devil sold tickets. And tickets are the right word, because from very early on the tower was something people paid to touch. Go back to the 4th of July, 1893. Two local ranchers, William Rogers and Willard Ripley, decided to climb the tower for the Independence Day celebration. There was no established route, no gear that could take those sheer columns, so they built one. Over weeks they drove a long line of wooden pegs into a continuous vertical crack between two columns, stringing them together into a ladder that ran hundreds of feet up the side of the rock. On the 4th, in front of a crowd said to number over 1,000 people who had come by wagon across the prairie, Rogers climbed the peg ladder to the summit and unfurled a flag. It was a spectacle, and it was a business. Concessions were sold. Rogers' wife made the flag. The event was promoted, the crowd was fed, and the tower had, for the first time, been turned into a paid attraction. The stunt worked so well that people kept climbing that wooden ladder for decades. Remnants of it are still bolted to the rock. The tower kept generating spectacle because spectacle kept generating revenue. In 1941, a professional parachutist named George Hopkins jumped from a plane and landed on the flat summit as a publicity stunt, having bet that he could do it. He could. What he could not do was get down. His plan to drop climbing rope failed when the rope landed in a tangle he could not use, and Hopkins was stranded on top of Devil's Tower for 6 days while the entire country followed the story in the newspapers. Food and blankets were dropped by air. Attempts were made and abandoned. In the end it took an expert climbing party led by Jack Durrance, one of the few men who had found a real route up the natural rock, to reach Hopkins and bring him down. The rescue was front-page news for a week. You could not buy that kind of advertising, and the tower did not have to. It simply stood there being impossible, and the impossibility paid. There was serious climbing too, not only stunts. In 1937, the German-American climber Fritz Wiesner led the first ascent of the tower by genuine climbing rather than by ladder, working up the natural columns with rope and hands and almost no hardware, a landmark moment in American mountaineering. Each of these firsts, the peg ladder, the parachute, the free ascent, laid down another layer of fame, and fame is a resource you can mine. Meanwhile, the ground around the tower was being mined in the plainest sense. Northeast Wyoming sits on some of the richest bentonite clay deposits on Earth, the swelling volcanic ash used in drilling mud and foundry sand, and the surrounding country runs on ranching, on oil and gas leases, on the extractive economy of the high plains. The tower is the one piece of that landscape that pays its way by being looked at rather than dug up. That is the pattern to hold on to. A rock does not have to be a fallen tree to be valuable. It only has to be strange enough that people will travel to see it and pay to be near it. And once something is that valuable, the question of who owns it stops being philosophical. On the 24th of September, 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed a proclamation making Devil's Tower the very first national monument in the history of the United States. It was the debut use of the Antiquities Act, a law Congress had passed only months earlier. The act had been written in response to the looting of ancient sites in the Southwest, the carting away of pottery and stone from places like the Cliff Dwellings, and it gave the president power to set aside federal land as protected monuments by his signature alone, without waiting for Congress. Devil's Tower was the test case, the first turn of a key that would eventually lock up millions of acres. Protection is a good word and a soft one, and it hides what protection also is. To make the tower a monument was to formally draw a line around it and declare it the property of the federal government, held in trust for the nation. That sounds unarguable until you ask which nation, and until you remember whose land it had been within living memory, and until you remember how that land had changed hands. Because the tower does not sit in neutral country. It sits at the western edge of the Black Hills, and the story of the Black Hills is the story of one of the largest land takings in American history. In 1868, the United States signed the Fort Laramie Treaty with the Lakota and their allies. The treaty was unambiguous. It set aside the Great Sioux Reservation, which included the whole of the Black Hills, He Sapa, the heart of the world in Lakota understanding, for the exclusive use of the Lakota people. It promised that no unauthorized person would be allowed to settle in or even pass through that territory. It was, on paper, one of the strongest guarantees the government ever made to a native nation. It held for 6 years. In 1874, an army expedition led by George Custer went into the Black Hills, in direct violation of the treaty the government had signed, and confirmed what rumor had long suggested: gold. In the grassroots, as the reports put it, gold you could find with a pan and a strong back. The news detonated. Prospectors poured into the hills the government had promised would stay closed, and the government, rather than keeping its own treaty and holding them back, chose the miners. It first tried to buy the Black Hills. When the Lakota refused to sell the heart of their world, the pressure turned to war, and after the campaigns of 1876, including the destruction of Custer's command at the Little Bighorn, Congress simply took what it wanted. In 1877, Congress passed an act seizing the Black Hills. To force agreement, rations that had been promised by treaty were cut off until leaders signed, starvation used as a pen. The Great Sioux Reservation was carved apart. The Black Hills, gold and all, passed into the hands of the United States. And it was onto federal land created by that seizure that Devil's Tower would be planted as a national monument 3 decades later. The first monument in the country stood on ground that had been taken in breach of a standing treaty. Bear Lodge, the bear's own house, became a possession of the government that had renamed it after a devil. The law itself said so, eventually. This is the part that almost never makes it into the visitor center. The Lakota never accepted the taking. They pressed the claim for generations, through courts that turned them away and rules written to keep them out, until finally, in 1980, the case reached the Supreme Court of the United States. In United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, the court looked at the seizure of the Black Hills and did something it rarely does. It agreed. It found that the 1877 Act had been a taking of property that required just compensation under the Constitution, and that the compensation had never been paid. The justices did not mince the history. One opinion described a course of dealing marked by bad faith. The court awarded the Lakota the 1877 value of the land plus interest running across the intervening century, a sum then set around $106 million, and the Lakota said no. They refused the money. They have refused it ever since. Their position was that the Black Hills were never for sale in 1877 and are not for sale now, that accepting payment would be selling He Sapa after the fact and legitimizing the theft. The award was placed in an interest-bearing trust account with the federal government, and it has sat there growing for more than 40 years, swelling past $1 billion, untouched. It is one of the strangest ledgers in the country. More than $1 billion that belongs to a people who will not spend it, because spending it would mean agreeing that the heart of the world had a price, and they will not agree to that. Every visitor who pays a fee to enter the monument, every dollar spent in the towns that live off the tower, moves through a landscape whose ownership the highest court in the land has already ruled was taken wrongly. The rock was named, the land was priced, the price was refused, and the tower keeps drawing crowds all the same. The crowds got much larger in 1977, and for a reason that has nothing to do with geology or treaties, and everything to do with how an image becomes a commodity. That year, Steven Spielberg released Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and he chose Devil's Tower as the place where humanity meets the visitors from the sky. The tower became the shape the main character sculpts out of mashed potatoes, molds out of mud, cannot stop drawing, the object of an obsession the film never fully explains. For millions of people who would never read a survey report, that film is where the tower entered their minds, already loaded with mystery, already a beacon, already something not quite of this world. Visitation surged after the film. The strangeness that the Silicon Tree movement reads as evidence of a lost forest, and that the Lakota read as the House of the Bear, Hollywood read as a landing pad, and sold. The tower has been, in turn, a church, a curiosity, a monument, and a set. Each reading drew its own kind of pilgrim. Each pilgrim spent money in the same few towns. Those overlapping claims still collide on the rock itself, most sharply over climbing. By the late 20th century, Devil's Tower had become one of the premier destinations for technical rock climbers in North America, its columns offering long, clean, crack climbs found almost nowhere else. Thousands climb it every year, many through commercial guides who sell the ascent as a product. But June is the month of greatest ceremonial importance to the native nations who hold the tower sacred, the season of sundances and prayer, and the sight and sound of climbers on the walls during that time was, to many, a desecration of an active place of worship. In 1995, the National Park Service adopted a management plan that asked climbers to voluntarily stay off the tower during the month of June, out of respect, and that ended commercial climbing permits for that month. Commercial climbing guides sued, arguing that the government was favoring one religion by managing public land around native ceremony. The case, known as Bear Lodge Multiple Use Association versus Babbitt, worked through the federal courts in the late 1990s. The voluntary closure survived, precisely because it was voluntary rather than enforced, a request rather than a ban. Climbing in June drops sharply but never stops. The compromise satisfied no one completely, which is often the shape of an honest compromise. The rock remains, at once, a sacred site and a recreation resource, a lodge and a crag, depending entirely on who is looking up at it. So step back and look at the whole shape of it. A tower of phonolite stands alone in the Wyoming grass, fluted with vertical lines that the eye insists on turning into bark. Modern geology explains those lines correctly, as the frozen record of a cooling crack, and in the same breath admits it still does not fully agree on how the tower as a whole came to be. A survey renamed a bear into a devil because a devil was easier to take. A ladder of wooden pegs turned the rock into a paid spectacle before it turned 20. The first national monument in the nation was set upon ground seized from the Lakota in violation of a signed treaty, a seizure the Supreme Court itself later called a taking made in bad faith. The people it was taken from were awarded a fortune and have refused every cent of it for over 40 years rather than agree that their sacred hills could be bought. And a film turned the whole loaded thing into a beacon and sold the image to the world. The Silicon Tree believers are wrong about the cellulose. There is no wood in Devil's Tower, and there never was. But notice how much they got right about the feeling, and notice what the correct answer conveniently talks over. They were right that the tower is out of scale with its world. They were right that the naming was too quick, that columnar jointing labels the grooves and then goes quiet about everything larger. They were right that something about the official story feels like a file closed early. They just aimed that instinct at the rock, at biology, when the real thing closed early was the ledger. The real lost civilization here was never a forest. It was a treaty. The real reset was not a clear cut of mile-high trees. It was the cutting off of rations in 1877 until hungry men signed away the heart of the world. The bark lines are a crack in cooling stone. That much is settled, and it is worth saying plainly. But the tower they run down is standing on a wound the highest court in the country agreed was never healed, holding a debt of over $1 billion that no one will collect, wearing a name that was never its own. Geologists named the grooves columnar jointing and moved on. The question of who the ground belongs to is still, to this day, sitting in a trust account, growing interest, unclaimed, unresolved, refusing to close. Make of that what you will.